All right, please welcome back to the channel our friend Darya Dolzikova, who's a senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. She's beaming in from London. Darya, it is great to see you again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back.
Before we get to the subject at hand, let me review a few headlines real quick. The first is the USS Gerald R. Ford has left its home port of Norfolk on what the Navy is calling a regularly scheduled deployment. Now, we've received word from one of our sources that the assigned Air Wing, CAG-8, has not flown aboard yet because there are currently some issues with the advanced arresting gear that the crew is wrestling with. Obviously, you can't trap airplanes if you don't have working arresting gear. And we'll provide updates on that as we get the information. Meanwhile, as we said would happen, the USS Nimitz, the first of the Nimitz-class carriers that is on its final deployment, has joined the USS Carl Vinson in the North Arabian Sea, certainly in response to the current conflict in that region that we'll be talking about during this episode with Danya. And finally, current events-wise, or finally headlines-wise, President Trump, who's obviously had a pretty busy few last days, is now in my former hometown of The Hague in the Netherlands for a NATO summit. Already there's been some news generated by this around Trump's interpretation of what Article 5 actually means. And I'm sure there will be more to discuss as this summit goes on, so stay tuned for that. So Darya, you and I spoke about 2 months ago, it seems like 2 years ago now, based on this article that you and our good friend Justin Bronk, two-time Mucci Award winner, wrote back in March, about 3 months ago. And the opening paragraph of this white paper was, while strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities are often cast in the light of avoiding escalation, underlying all considerations is the efficacy of military action to halt proliferation. So that was kind of in the abstract, and current events, most recent events over the last 72 hours or so have made that no longer an abstract. So we'll get your thoughts on where we are now as a result of everything. But let me review the bidding. So I did the episode with you and I back in April. And at that time, we discussed the nuclear facilities and the state of Iran's nuclear program, including how they were complying or not with JPOA and other things like that. So if folks haven't seen that episode, it's still highly germane to this discussion, so check it out. And we went through some details of places like Natanz and Fordow and Esfahan. So fast forward to a few weeks ago, the Israelis unilaterally started conducting strikes into Iran. And at that time, as an aviator, I marveled at how they had established dominion over the skies of Iran. They were flying not drones, but manned aircraft. They shut down the integrated air defense in a very 21st century way, not by jamming it, but by hacking it. And so they were able to do pretty devastating destruction of both counter-military and counter-regime targets, including taking out high-value human targets like the chief of staff, the head of the Republican Guard, and two of their principal nuclear engineers using small diameter bombs. We discussed that in great detail with our good friend Slogo, and then followed that up with a conversation about specifically some of the other things they'd hit, including the F-14s. Obviously, that's something I hate to see. There was some discussion online as to what was the actual status of these Tomcats. Were they derelict? Were they museum pieces? At some level, that doesn't matter. But there's more footage than just this FLIR footage that has emerged, and it looks like it wasn't just these that people claimed were longtime derelict. They took out some other Tomcats as well. Now, based on the success of that IDF effort, President Trump left the G7, and this Truth Social post sort of makes it seem like he was very much interested, based on how it was going, in sort of jumping on, let's call it the bandwagon. So he used the pronoun we, now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. And as I said before we started recording, if I was a member of the Iranian Air Force who's flying over Iran, I'd be like, who's we? right? Because I don't see any American airplanes on my wing, quite frankly, Mr. President. Iran had good sky trackers and other defensive equipment, and plenty of it, but it doesn't compare to American-made, conceived, and manufactured, quote-unquote, stuff. Nobody does it better than the good old USA. So he posts that, and then the question is, okay, so what are we getting involved? I did an episode about that and some of the pushback from the base of the Republican Party that is not interested in what they describe as forever wars. But here was Trump's statement back when you and I first talked about the potential for American involvement. And here he is sitting down in the Oval Office back then with Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me play that sound.
If the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
So is that a yes?
You know, it's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is.
So that was April. Then fast forward to basically the end, like a week ago, less than a week ago, right? And so this was his statement from the Oval Office at that time.
Ideas as to what to do, but I haven't made a final. I like to make the final decision 1 second before it's due, you know, because things change. I mean, especially with war, things change with war. It can go from one extreme to the other.
So he had been briefed on the contingency operation. Anecdotally, people said he'd approved it, but he was holding off. And so the sort of intelligentsia were sort of thinking that Bannon had got to him, particularly, and he wasn't going to go through with it. Further, that was backed up by the press secretary saying the following.
The fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks.
So it turns out that was actually tactical deception. And so here comes a strike. I did a live stream. I was at a restaurant downtown. I get a text from one of my Patreon patrons, turn on the TV, brother. I did so, and obviously it's like, okay, no notice, live stream Saturday night where we're kind of dealing with the information real time. So at that time, all that was known was what President Trump had posted on Truth Social about the composition. He said, okay, we got in and out safely, B-2s, 3 targets, Esfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. And that's all we knew. So I'm like, okay, GBU-57s. We weren't sure at that time whether the bombers had originated out of Whiteman Air Force Base or Guam, because the other thing that the Pentagon had put out is we've staged some bombers in Guam, which also turns out to be a misdirection ultimately. That was a misdirection. So the people would be facing that way. So that's all we knew. And the next morning, and now that we're talking about last Sunday, Secretary Hegseth and the chairman brief what is called Midnight Hammer. And here's the graphic that describes an overview of the conduct of Midnight Hammer. You can see the timeline along the bottom. Here's a very detailed, granular breakdown of Midnight Hammer. And this is by Ian Ellis Jones. I won't read the overview there, the timeline, but some of the questions that arose during the live stream were, how many B-2s, how many GBUs? You can see that there in the the right column. The other question was, what other airplanes? So from the silhouettes there, you've got Growlers off of the carrier, Vinson. Some people had wondered, hey, did the Navy get involved at all? So Growlers used for on-call suppression of enemy air defenses. I don't know if they fired any of their ARGMs, the advanced anti-radiation missiles that they carry. It's the new gen HARM missile. You see F-16s there, and you see F-35 silhouette. So there was sort of a lead of tactical fighters in front of the B-2s. Let's call it attached tar cap. Also, there was some question about, will the Israelis coordinate ops with the Americans during this event? It turns out the Israelis provided sort of real-time integrated air defense feedback to ensure that the SAM systems were down. Obviously, that's a big deal to the American assets. The other element was Tomahawk land attack missiles, TLAM, were fired from submarines in the North Arabian Sea. And you can see the number there at the bottom of this graphic. So you're like, okay, I should do an episode about that now that we know. But before I could even start to think about that, the next element in the plot, as it were, was the president, who kind of promised that it was one and done, put out this, where he's basically calling for regime change. And it's MIGA, which is Make Iran Great Again. And this caused great hue and cry with the base, as well as a lot of hay was made of this idea in broadcast media. And this is the kind of thing that gets us in trouble, right? This is like conflating Al-Qaeda with the Taliban. Suddenly you're into nation building. And no sooner had that been posted that the Iranians attacked the American base at Al-Udeid. They used 14 ballistic missiles, which is poetic because that's the number of GBU-57s that were dropped on the targets in Iran. But it turns out that they had telegraphed that they were going to do this. It started with the Qataris. Here's the Prime Minister of Qatar. And they in turn told the Americans. So I don't know what they used to knock those down, whether they used Patriots or whatever, but there's a lot of air defense surrounding the American facilities in Qatar. And then the last thing, as we sit here right now, that's part of this whole narrative that is rapidly changing. Now there's some concern, there's some frustration with the administration about this report that CNN put out, that the New York Times published an article around, that the targets, Iran's nuclear capability was not, in fact, obliterated, Trump's word. And so that raises the idea that we're going to have to go back in there, or so forth and so on. You know, it's sort of like, if you go for the king, you better kill him. Otherwise, you're just going to send the pieces scattering. And now, while they've characterized the Iranian nuclear aspirations, nuclear weapons aspirations, as being set back years, it turns out maybe only months. All right, so that's a lot. So Darya, your thoughts based on all of this?
Yeah, so I think the last 2 weeks, the Israeli strikes, the American strikes, have really been a test for the efficiency and efficacy, I guess, of the use of military force as a counter-proliferation tool. And I mean, I would struggle to call this whole thing a strategic win, frankly. Again, it's very early days, so it'll be some time until we get a fuller picture, if we ever get one, of the extent of the damage that's actually been done to the Iranian program. But you know, something that I think is worth keeping in mind is, when we look at a country's ability or decision to move towards a nuclear weapon, there's the sort of two things to look at, broadly speaking: the capabilities, the technical ability to actually produce a nuclear weapon, and then the political will to do so. So on the technical side of things, which is where what most of the conversation has been around, the Israeli and US strikes seem to have set back the program somewhat. They have inflicted some damage on the program. The extent of that damage is still not clear. We're getting bits and pieces of intelligence assessments on battle damage, both by the Israelis and the Americans. So the Americans, if you take the DIA assessment that was leaked recently, that DIA assessment, I think, said that the program was set back by at most a few months, which isn't a huge amount in the grand scheme of things. If we take the more generous approach by looking at the Israeli assessment, the Israelis, I think, have come out and said that cumulatively, the US and the Israeli attacks have set back the program by about 2 years. Fine, that's significant in a way, but at the end of the day, this is a program that the Iranians have had for decades. The latent expertise in the country is extensive. So the program can eventually be reconstituted with time. How much time it takes will depend on how much damage was actually inflicted. but also how much capability the Iranians actually feel that they need, right? They might not have to reconstitute the whole program if the decision does eventually become to move towards a nuclear weapon. There's a reason the program is as dispersed as it is. There's a lot of redundancy built into it, right? So there's 3 enrichment facilities, some of them underground. So it's a redundant program. If they decided to move towards a nuclear weapons capability, they could presumably do that in a single location with a much smaller number of centrifuges. There's been some reports that the Iranians moved some of their fissile materials, the uranium that would go inside of a nuclear weapon, that they moved that out of the facilities that were targeted in advance of the American strikes. So some of that has probably been salvaged somewhere. They also have centrifuges that they were producing, the Iranians, that were not yet installed in the facilities that were targeted. We don't know the location of those centrifuges. They might, again, be in a facility that's not been targeted. So there is still capability for Iran to, most likely, again, I don't know the exact picture on the ground, for them to move towards a nuclear weapon with time, again, if they decided to do that. I think the more important thing to look at is the political resolve, right? So that half of the equation. What have the last 2 weeks done, not just to the technical capability, which can get reconstituted, but to Iran's threat perception, right? What has Iran learned from the last 2 weeks? And that can go 2 ways. On the one hand side, the Iranians might decide, actually, in response to all of this, the best thing we can do is to be fully transparent on our program, allow the IAEA into all the facilities that we need them, that they want to access, and be fully transparent with the international community, not enrich past, 3.67, 5%, whatever it is, and seriously roll back the program. On the flip side, the other lesson that they might learn from this is that actually having a threshold nuclear capability, a very advanced but not weaponized program, has been insufficient to deter extensive attacks, not just on nuclear facilities in the country, but on other parts of the country's critical national infrastructure, leadership, etc. So the conclusion they might draw from that is that actually the best way forward is to, yes, reconstitute the program, potentially advance it further, and maybe even push towards a nuclear weapon. Based on some of what we're seeing coming out of Iran now in terms of the bills being passed in their parliament to decrease cooperation with the IAEA, some of the other statements that are coming out, if I was to be betting, I would bet on the latter, that the Iranians are taking from this the fact that they need probably a deeper, harder, and more hidden program and potentially a nuclear weapons capability.
So the analog for that choice in the matrix is sort of North Korea. I've seen that bandied about, where they go underground, do not cooperate, and suddenly they have a nuclear weapon capability because nobody's been keeping track. Do you think that that is a sound analog?
Yeah, I think it's a good comparison. It's one that I've drawn in the past as well. It's not a like for like. The situation was quite different in North Korea. I mean, for one, they hadn't been militarily attacked. There was serious consideration of carrying out military attacks against North Korea's program as well. So it's not a like for like comparison, but I think there's some good parallels that can be drawn. What we saw in the North Korean case eventually is basically they decided, after a while of failed negotiations over the program, they decided to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the North Koreans did. So that's the treaty that underlines sort of the foundation of the international non-proliferation regime. So the North Koreans decided they gave notice that they're going to be withdrawing from the treaty in 1993, and member states of the NPT have the right to withdraw from the treaty under Article 10. If the state decides that there are extraordinary events, quote unquote, related to the subject matter of this treaty, so the NPT, that have jeopardized the supreme interests of the member state. So the Iranians could potentially withdraw. I think at this point, they could probably make a fairly strong case that there have been extreme events that would allow it to withdraw. But the point being that the North Koreans basically gave that notice. And under the NPT, a member state withdrawing has to give 3 months notice of withdrawal. So the North Koreans did that in 1993. There were some negotiations that happened. The agreed framework was eventually reached. So North Korea then suspended its withdrawal, basically. It said, we're not withdrawing anymore. But they did that on the last day of their 3-month notice. There was kind of some back and forth diplomacy. The agreed framework was implemented sort of not particularly well. It struggled a little bit on both sides. And eventually, 10 years later, the North Koreans said, you know what, no, we are pulling out of the NPT, and we've already given our 3 months notice 10 years ago. So we're pulling out tomorrow, basically. That means that a number of NPT member states still don't recognize that North Korea has pulled out of the NPT. But I think something like that could be a pathway that the Iranians could follow as well. Give notice, try to get as much as they can during that 3-month window in terms of negotiations. And then depending on how that goes, suspend withdrawal, but we'd still have this sort of Damocles hanging over our heads that, Iran might, like North Korea, one day say, actually, we're pulling out of the NPT. And as you and your viewers will well know, North Korea then subsequently tested a nuclear weapon and now has a nuclear weapons capability. So, we could very well end up in a similar situation with Iran.
So that's an important detail, because I think people might be confused with what was Iran's status with respect to the NPT. Mm. The predicate for Rising Lion was the Atomic Energy Agency found them in violation of the NPT.
So I'll just correct that slightly. So it's the IAEA Board of Governors that found Iran in non-compliance with its comprehensive safeguards arrangement, so not directly the NPT. So basically what that means is that there were a number of outstanding issues that Iran had with the International Atomic Energy Agency in terms of, with regard to a number of different facilities that Iran had previously not declared to the agency. And the agency basically had some questions around what kind of activities took place at those sites. And there was some discrepancy in the accounting of the material that was at those sites. So the agency had, some questions about historical matters and basically the current location of that material that was unaccounted for. And Iran was given every opportunity over years to address those questions and failed to do so, kept giving really not credible responses to the agency, stonewalling the agency, so really dragging its feet. So eventually, the Board of Governors in the last, it was 2 weeks ago, the last Board of Governors meeting, they had voted to find Iran in non-compliance with its comprehensive safeguards agreement, with its CSA obligations, based on Iran's lack of cooperation with the agency on those questions.
So Darya, Midnight Hammer hit 3 basic targets: Esfahan, Fordow, and Natanz. Give us a quick primer on what each of those facilities does, because I think the general public doesn't understand the difference. And again, as a reminder, Fordow and Natanz were hit by GBU-57s dropped from B-2s. Esfahan was hit by TLAMs launched from submarines in the North Arabian Sea. Mm-hmm. And I think the way in the BDA the damage has been characterized is Esfahan was the most damaged of those 3. But remind us what each one of those facilities does.
Right. So Natanz and Fordow hosted uranium enrichment facilities. So again, for those who might not be as familiar, basically it's the process that uranium has to go through to get it to a level where it would be usable either for reactor fuel or potentially for a nuclear weapon. So at Natanz, there was the pilot fuel enrichment plant. So that site was above ground, and it contained, I think it was 3 cascades of centrifuges, and it was producing uranium enriched to 60%. So what we would expect for weapons grade uranium, it's about 90%. You could make nuclear weapons with less, but normally we're looking at 90% enrichment for weapons use. So the pilot fuel enrichment plant was enriching to 60% enriched uranium. The facility underground at Natanz, so same complex, but this one was underground, hosted part of the PFEP, part of the pilot fuel enrichment plant, but underground. And then it hosted the fuel enrichment plant. It's a bit confusing, but basically, the facility underground at Natanz was Iran's largest enrichment facility in terms of numbers of centrifuges and numbers of cascades. So I think there were 82 operational cascades at the time of the last IAEA report. So it's a large facility. And then at Fordo, that facility was critical for a number of different reasons. It was also enriching to 60% enriched uranium, and it's the facility where the bulk of Iran's 60% enriched uranium was being produced. And more than that, it was using advanced centrifuge models, as had the pilot fuel enrichment plant at Natanz, but it was using advanced centrifuge models, which are more efficient than the older generation ones. And it was using 20% enriched feed. So basically, instead of feeding the cascades with natural or 5% enriched uranium, those cascades were being fed with 20% enriched uranium. So basically, the starting point for enrichment was higher. So it was a really, really critical facility. It was, like I said, producing the bulk of around 60% enriched uranium and more efficiently than the other site, which is why it was as deeply buried as it was. I think the estimates that I've seen publicly, 80 to 90 meters underground, hence the need for these bunker buster bombs. Isfahan is quite a large complex. It contains a number of different facilities that serve a range of purposes. So there was a uranium conversion plant at Isfahan. So that's where the uranium hexafluoride, which is the material that goes inside the centrifuges to then enrich it. So that uranium hexafluoride was produced at Isfahan. There was also a facility there for the production of fuel for Iran's research reactor. There was also a capability there for the production of uranium metal. And why that's key is because you can't put gas uranium hexafluoride inside of a nuclear weapon. It needs to be converted to a metal for the nuclear weapon core. So that's where Iran had the capability that we know of for the production of uranium metal. And then critically, Isfahan is also where at least some of Iran's enriched uranium stocks were being kept. So when they're produced at Natanz or Fordo, some of them will, be there for a little while, but the storage place, from my understanding, is again at Isfahan. Hence why that facility was targeted as well.
And as I said before, Isfahan is mostly above ground, so that's what made it a good TLAM target. TLAM has some bunker busting capability, but not to the degree of a GBU-57. Certainly can't get down 200 plus feet as was required at Natanz and Fordo.
Some of the facilities at Isfahan are underground as well. So there were some tunnels there where the uranium stocks might have been kept. So it's not all above ground, but yes, large parts of it are above ground.
I just want to say this as a veteran aviator. Regardless of what the BDA yields in terms of weeks or months or years of damage, this is an amazing capability, as the president has stated. As a Tomcat guy, most of our sorties were maybe 2 hours long. To fly a ejection seat airplane 37 hours from your home base in Conus, in this case, Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, tank twice on the way in and the way out. This is seriously amazing capability. So hats off to the U.S. Air Force pilots who conducted that part of the strike, the tanker pilots. Obviously, the Navy did good work with the submarines and the other aviation assets involved. So we will be infinitum studying the BDA as we have here, but I just want to say BZ to those involved in Operation Midnight Hammer. So Darya, you've been in high demand over the last few days. Thank you for joining us today. Keep your phone charged up because I'm sure we'll be pinging you again in the near future.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And don't forget, Punk's Force is now on the streets. I'll put in the episode description where you can get it either at Amazon, and Amazon has Kindle and audio formats. Naval Institute Press, the publisher, has a 40% discount. Use the code PUNK40 for 40% off. Meanwhile, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.